For more now on how these reforms will be perceived from an international standpoint, we're joined by Clayton Dube. He's joining us live from Los Angeles. He's the head of the U.S. China Institute at the University of Southern California. Welcome to our broadcast. I'm sure you had a chance to hear Nathan's story. It sounds like the State Department was kind of caught flat-footed. Were you surprised at the breadth of this?
Well, I think everybody anticipated getting a lot more information. We didn't anticipate getting it today. We expected that it would come out about 1 week after the close of the plenum.
And so you probably haven't had a lot of time to digest it, but are there some headlines that jump out at you, things that may have caught you by surprise or that you see as more significant?
Well, I think the overall read is the most important point. Number one, this is a really bold document. They're talking about reforms in rural-urban relations, in the financial sector, reforms to the judicial system, many different areas. It was just mentioned the creation of this National Security Council. Those sorts of things are really dramatic shifts. And while there's not a lot of detail in this document, the intent seems fairly clear. And this is a bold agenda.
You just used the words dramatic and bold, which are pretty huge, but you also used the word intent. And then there's the other word, implementation. How tough is it going to be to take the intent and actually create something lasting out of this?
Well, that's always the challenge. You're talking about really sweeping reforms in long-established institutions in Chinese society. With regard, for example, to the household registration system, the hukou system, for example. This is something that's been around since the late 1950s and has had an impact on how every Chinese lives for that entire period. And so changing something like that, changing land rights, these are dramatic moves and will take some time. This, of course, this report, even as long as it is, doesn't include all of the details, and it doesn't include any plan for a rollout. Will there be an attempt to do it in a few places first and then learn from that experience and then do it elsewhere? All of that remains to be seen. The same is true for the education through labor program that exists. And that, too, is something that's been around for a long time, antagonizes many, is deeply unpopular, and yet it's something that the police have relied on and become quite accustomed to using. So changing it overnight will not be possible. It's going to take time, and the devil is always in the details, and everything depends on that word that you used, implementation. Implementation is the key.
Clayton, let me ask you one final question. Do you think you're with the U.S. China Institute out at USC, and I'm just wondering if there's a U.S. Western perspective on all of this and a Chinese perspective, because I was talking to someone earlier today, and they said that the U.S. seems to be fixated on the one-child policy. This is the one that they've really kind of glommed onto. But in China, it's the economic reforms that they've kind of glommed onto that they're looking at and finding far more interesting. Do you think that this is being perceived in different ways from the West and the East?
Well, I think there's a number of factors here. Ultimately, these economic reforms are dramatic ones. If banks become real banks, that's going to change the Chinese economy in important ways. It could change the allocation of resources. It could stimulate private business. It could do all sorts of things. Again, we have to wait and see. But you ask a great question. Why did most of the reports in the United States and elsewhere initially latch on to the change in the family planning program and, to a lesser extent, the change in the policing system? One is, I think everybody is aware that China has the world's largest population and has, for more than 30 years, had a very strong program to control births. And so this is something that every American viewer, every American reader, every American listener could make sense of. It was part of what they knew about China, and it was a way for journalists to connect with where their audience was.
All right, Clayton Dube, thank you so much for joining us from Los Angeles.